Welcome to EVN Report. My name is Maria Titizian, and joining me today in the studio is Dr. Nerses Kopalyan, author of the monthly series EVN Security Briefing, Security Report. Welcome to the program, Nerses.
Thank you for having me, Maria.
And it's great that you're here in Yerevan. We're not doing this.
Always great to be in Yerevan.
Well, we're going to be discussing the security briefing for May, which is called Competing and Nonlinear Warfare, the Strategy of De-Hybridization. We've had extensive discussions, you've written extensively, and we know Armenia's security strategy has evolved from the Russo-Soviet model to a comprehensive security doctrine focused on countering Azerbaijan's asymmetrical disparity and nonlinear warfare. I'll leave the explanations to you in a minute, but Armenia has employed or should employ two strategic objectives: deterrence by denial, which you've written about, to prevent Azerbaijan from achieving its goals, and a resiliency model to disrupt efforts to weaken Armenian society. Now, while deterrence by denial is a short-term measure, resiliency is a long-term strategy that can complement Armenia's comprehensive security approach. You write that Armenia needs an intermediate approach to transition from its current severe security situation to a stable long-term system. And to counter Azerbaijan's non-linear warfare, Armenia has to adopt the concept of de-hybridization. So I'll let you take it from there and explain what you mean by de-hybridization. Perhaps also, we could talk a little bit about what you mean by non-linear warfare.
Of course.
Yeah? Okay.
So de-hybridization is not my concept. It's the latest trend in security studies in trying to understand how certain states that are consistently subjected to hybrid attacks may develop mechanisms to basically curtail or deny the ability of those states that are utilizing hybrid warfare. Thus, the objective to de-hybridize. Non-linear warfare basically covers the broad area of both hybrid warfare and asymmetrical warfare. And in that context, hybrid warfare is a form of non-linear warfare, a specific type, but non-linear approaches are a lot more comprehensive. We saw Russia, for example, enhance its non-linear approach from 2014 after the absorption of Crimea, Donbass, and Luhansk, all the way until the 2022 invasion. Azerbaijan has attempted to basically emulate some of these non-linear approaches. Though Azerbaijan's non-linear approach has been primarily dominated by a hybrid strategy, what we're paying attention to is that as Armenia slowly develops the capacity to deny some of these hybrid approaches, Azerbaijan might expand its strategy and therefore go beyond the hybrid into a more comprehensive non-linear structuration. This is also in the literature we talk about sort of these invisible wars, right? And so the non-linear kind of works interchangeably with that assumption. Most people understand non-linear to be hybrid, but let's consider non-linear to be a little more expansive than hybrid. So in that context, Armenia's policy in the immediate has been the notion of deterrence by denial. And what this basically means, that we've written and talked about this extensively, is that while Armenia now lacks the capacity to fully counterattack or match Azerbaijan's capabilities, it has attempted to address and mitigate those attacks by simply making sure that Azerbaijan doesn't always achieve its objectives, thus to deny their objectives. In that context, if you deny an antagonistic state from being successful in its hybrid attacks, you have somewhat neutralized them, right? You have deterred them from succeeding. Therefore, we use the term denial. Like I said, this is a very immediate approach until you develop long-term capabilities. What de-hybridization does as a concept is that it gives a state the instruments, mechanism, and the processes to defend itself against hybrid and kinetic activities. Okay, and it also attempts to mitigate the weaker state's vulnerabilities, right? So if you know, for example, the attacking state keeps targeting you on X, Y, and Z areas, which are your vulnerabilities, the fact that they're able to develop the capacity to curtail that attacking state from targeting those vulnerabilities, you have denied them, right, a certain success route that they had in the past, that in the current they will not be able to succeed. Therefore, you have de-hybridized them within that context.
So it's a defensive posturing again. For example,
most definitely.
Right, you're right. It's not that Armenia should engage in cyber attacks against Azerbaijan, but strengthen and shore up its own cybersecurity. Am I understanding
Correct.
this
That's one
correctly?
example. Right? So,
Sure.
in the cyber domain, right? Let's say Azerbaijan, implements a very large cyber attack on Armenia. Right? De-hybridization will basically be designed around the approach of making sure that those cyber attacks fail. And if they consistently fail, for example, right, that means Azerbaijan has been denied. So its hybrid attacks have failed. Therefore, their initial initiative has failed. But if your design is one of they attack, you don't have the sufficient capacity to defend, but your response is to counterattack. These are two different things, right? So, for example, if they take down your banking system and then you take down their banking system, that's not the same as them attacking and failing to take down your banking system. So de-hybridization revolves around making sure that they fail. Whether the extent to which you're able to engage in a counterattack, that has nothing to do with de-hybridization. That's a different policy that comes down the line when there is some asymmetry between the two actors.
Okay, so this method that you talk about targets Azerbaijan's 6 hybrid warfare dimensions. Let's go through those dimensions and see in which areas Armenia can, in the short term, take action, if you will.
Sure. We've written about this a while back when we did an extensive study on Azerbaijan's hybrid capabilities. And, we should show that the 6 areas that Azerbaijan basically, the 6 dimensions that Azerbaijan utilizes hybrid warfare, basically begins at the diplomatic front. And there's the economic, the cyber, the informational, what we call the unconventional, and then the military dimensions, right? So these are the 6 ones. Now, generally speaking, from all of these, what are the most vulnerable areas that Armenia has, right? So we know that the unconventional and military component is the most vulnerable one because Azerbaijan has much stronger military capabilities for multiple reasons we discussed in the past, and they keep basically utilizing Armenia's weakest points or enhancing Armenia's fragility by tapping into military and unconventional approaches. So what has Armenia done to deny this Azerbaijan's capacity to tap into these fragile areas? They have, as we've spoken about, diplomatized their security, utilized international political capital, basically brought in Western actors by creating a region that's become geopolitically more pluralistic, and thus, to some extent, mitigated Azerbaijan's ability to attack whenever they want, right? Or to use kinetic capacity whenever they want. It doesn't mean all these capacities have been neutralized, no. But what it means is, whereas in the past, Azerbaijan was able to do this a lot easier, more freely, they're right now a lot more constrained. So these are mechanisms of denying Azerbaijan from engaging in this behavior.
And it gives us breathing space.
Some breathing space, but more so, it also allows Armenia to develop the skill set and the capacity to enhance its de-hybridization and denial capacities. But when we look at frequency of attacks, right, frequency has primarily been in the diplomatic, cyber, and information space. Azerbaijan has completely failed to have any effects on Armenia in the economic dimension.
Well, because there's no economic...
Whatever the case might be. Or they haven't succeeded, for example, in convincing multinational corporations not to invest in Armenia. Or for example, there's been some conversations about this. Prior and after the 2020 war, Azerbaijan basically communicated and contacted all the multinational corporations that invest in Armenia, telling them to divest from a failed state, et cetera, et cetera. So that was an attempt at economic hybrid warfare. It failed, right? That's one example. So in the economic realm, they've been quite unsuccessful. But in the cyber, information, and diplomatic realm, this has been more of their success areas in the past. And so what has Armenia done, right, to de-hybridize the success of Azerbaijan's previous hybrid capabilities? And what we have seen, for example, in the diplomatic realm, whereas in the past, Azerbaijan very successfully controlled the narrative, very successfully convinced the international community that Armenia was a Russian satellite and occupying force, regardless of the fact that these are false claims. It had worked in the international level. So Armenia, by virtue of doing its Western pivot and implementing a policy of diversification, has actually succeeded in curtailing this Azerbaijani narrative that had been so diplomatically successful for them. This is a minor example of how in the diplomatic realm, right, you went from a situation where Azerbaijan Azerbaijan was so used to diplomatically winning and reaping the dividends of it, to one where now they're struggling to compete with us in the narrative game because we have enhanced our diplomatic ability to dehybridize them. The same goes in the information warfare realm and the same in the cyber realm as we discussed. So in that context, right, again, Armenia, for example, does not go on the diplomatic offensive. Right? But what Armenia does is to make sure that Azerbaijan's attempt to diplomatically attack fails. So dehybridization, again, it revolves around the whole approach of whether in which of these, regardless of the 6 domains that we're talking about that Azerbaijan utilizes its hybrid warfare in, to make sure that those attacks fail. Not whether Armenia is able to match Azerbaijan in these domains or engage in counterattacks. So dehybridization is about making sure the opponent fails in its attacks as opposed to you attacking them within that same domain.
But do you think that Armenia in the cyber and information realms or dimensions has been able to achieve some successes? I mean, diplomatically, I understand it, with framing the narrative and all of that. But
I think in the cyber realm, it has, in the sense that we have not seen any shattering attacks against Armenia's infrastructure, banking system, healthcare system, right, et cetera, et cetera. Armenia's cyber capabilities have been sufficiently developed to sustain or mitigate an Azerbaijani attack. And, a lot of these, obviously, there have been, obviously, Azerbaijan has had some successes with the Pegasus attacks that we saw and other software and malware attacks that they've had. So this is not a foolproof system, of course, and sometimes we've succeeded, sometimes we haven't, obviously. But to answer your question, in that domain, it's a perpetual and consistent levels of attack. A lot of it is not publicized, of course, and so Armenia's ability to mitigate those attacks where you don't have broader societal or functional effects on institutions, et cetera, are kind of what we're looking at.
Well, cybersecurity experts would argue differently. I mean, right now, one of the biggest problems, even though Azerbaijan has not yet done it, but at any moment it can, I think the cybersecurity capabilities of those very important, infrastructure or networks or banking or anything that you can think of still has not even been regulated by law at the moment. And I think they're working in that direction, but cybersecurity capabilities are something, and we misunderstand warfare sometimes. I mean, a cyber attack on some very important
on water management systems.
Yeah, I
for
mean,
example,
imagine the
right?
chaos it would cause
on telephone satellite systems, etc. So yes, it could disrupt important forms of communications or basic social services that could have important consequences. And this is why, to answer your question, my point is that we have until now been relatively successful in curtailing or denying Azerbaijan from being able to achieve those kinds of harms. Whether we could be consistently successful, that's a different subject of conversation, right? But dehybridization entails you keep enhancing your dehybridization capabilities. So our cybersecurity experts are posing very important questions, right? If they see high risks in a certain area of cybersecurity, then those risks have to be addressed. If we don't, and there's a cyber attack and that succeeds, that means we have failed in this specific area to dehybridization.
Like many things, Nerses, we have plans, we have programs, we have set goals. Oftentimes, we don't then go back and measure the effectiveness of the programs, or in this case, the program to, let's say, deter or deny Azerbaijan's hybrid warfare tactics. So what constitutes effectiveness or ineffectiveness? And how does that determined and qualified? Is there a quantifiable set of metrics that we can use?
In the broader scholarship, or mostly when we do sort of risk assessment and qualify risk propensity and security studies, you quantify it. You quantify and you gauge basically risk propensity levels and the probability of success or failure rates. But again, these are mere probabilities. And most definitely there are metrics and mechanisms to gauge failure or success. And but of course, to do this, one must have access to pertinent data, right? So for example, if we were going back into the cybersecurity realm and we, for example, observe developments from, let's say, 2022 until now, and we see that there were X number of cybersecurity attacks on Armenia. And the level of success some may have had or complete failures, etc. Utilizing that, we could understand and develop a sort of a quantifiable matrix on success levels, failure levels, and in which dimension this was the case. Right, and so to that end, we also developed more of a comprehensive approach. Right, we would look at, for example, all of these 6 dimensions that Azerbaijan utilizes hybrid warfare attacks in, and then see within those dimensions the number of attacks, the success rates, and then we will quantify that or basically aggregate that data at a broader level to understand the overarching Azerbaijani approach. Generally speaking, right, again, we go back to what I discussed initially, Azerbaijan's success has been in the unconventional and military spheres. This is why when you get success rates, even though the numbers, the frequency is less, right, the success rate is higher. This is where Armenia needs to apply more attention to because of the success rate. Whereas in the other domains, right, while the frequency of attacks might be higher, the success rate tends to be a little lower. So it is qualifying, right, the relationship between frequency, success rates within the domains and aggregating these to understand how successful the de-hybridization approach has been.
So what resources does Armenia need to sustain its de-hybridization strategy over the long term?
Not simply sustain, but enhance.
Okay.
Right. For example, in the past, whereas Armenian diplomats or Armenia's foreign ministry did not study the demeanor, tactics, and approaches of Azerbaijan's foreign ministry, right now we do that, right? And so in this context, we've developed a healthy understanding of how Azerbaijan diplomats function in certain capitals, how to preempt and basically neutralize them before they could attack Armenia. We understood, for example, right after an expansive study, that Azerbaijan has a very comprehensive and well-established information blitz mechanisms where all of their diplomats are synchronized to undertake a specific narrative of attacking Armenia, whereas in the past, our response was ad hoc, kind of confused, reactive, etc., etc. So it's a very simple example of how we've enhanced our ability to basically anticipate and develop mechanisms of addressing that. And so on the diplomatic front, whether it's developing consistent talking points, relationships, narrative structures, etc., etc., enhancing those, developing those, anticipating what Azerbaijan is going to do, basing this anticipation on deep trend patterns, etc., is one example of what could be done. Cybersecurity is very, very straightforward, right? It's a question of capability, knowledge, and being able to address the attacks. Right now, Armenia is receiving some level of training and support from our French and American partners, and that is very important in basically securing, Armenia's communications, the ability of the opposing side to have access to information. One of the biggest problems we had, for example, during the 2020 war is that Azerbaijan had open access to our communications because the extent to which these were safeguarded, wasn't really the case, right? But now that's being changed, right? So what we call, OPSEC, operational security components in communication, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot that you do, right, to consistently both enhance your capabilities, but at the same time, understand the methods and techniques of your enemy and thus to anticipate them. In the past, we've never done this. We've never had propensity models where we gauge the risks with respect to specific actions that Azerbaijan may take, and based on that risk probability to develop a contingency planning. And so all of these are part of the whole de-hybridization thing. When we study, for example, countries that have been successful at this, Estonia stands out, right? You have this small, very small country who has been quite brilliant in de-hybridizing Russian threats, right? Or flipping Russian spies, right? Or being able to neutralize Russian cyber attacks and information warfare. So we see that a successful, well-developed de-hybridization model, even for a very small country, works. Now, does Estonia go on the offensive and counterattack Russian systems? No, because that's not what de-hybridization is all about. As long as Russia fails, right, to harm Estonia has won the hybrid game. This is kind of the logic that we're approaching with Armenia. We don't have to defeat Azerbaijan in the hybrid game. That's not how victory is defined in the hybrid warfare discourse. As long as Azerbaijan fails to achieve its objectives, we have won within this specific context.
You talked about, how in the past our diplomats were more or less reacting to issues, if they were reacting at all. Sometimes they weren't reacting at all. Since September 2022, when Azerbaijan launched its attack against sovereign Armenia, are there examples that you have seen in our foreign relations and our diplomacy where Armenia employed tactics to counter? I mean, because I don't think we've had time yet to be proactive.
To do this, or to do a comprehensive study of these kinds of behaviors, right?
Because, one of the big issues that I've seen as a journalist and an editor is our failure at strategic communication internally for the domestic audience, communication with the world and power centers and all of that. Now, there is some change. We see the foreign ministry being more proactive. The defense ministry is a whole other conversation that perhaps we leave for another time. Have we employed any of the tactics in the de-hybridization
of diplomatic threats?
Yeah.
We have. For example, soon as we had a shift in the foreign ministry, when Arat Mirzoyan took over and Armenia began its Western pivot, you saw a complete shift in proactiveness and an ability to communicate with Western partners, whereas in the past, the previous MFA and the foreign policy elite had failed to do that. And there are numerous examples of this, okay? Simply put, for example, when Armenia would engage discourse on security, prior to that, the only way that our diplomats were able to compete with Azerbaijan in the security discourse was that trying to convince our Western partners that we're not a Russian satellite. Well, so in that context, you were constantly on the defensive, while Azerbaijan was constantly on the offensive, right? So our diplomats would spend a lot of resources trying to convince Western partners on three things. One, that Armenia is not a Russian satellite, which requires a lot of resources to do. Two, that Azerbaijan is the aggressor, right? And three, that the Western capitals should be on Armenia's side. So you were engaged in a three-tier discourse because you were at such a disadvantage by virtue of Azerbaijan having been successful in the diplomatic hybrid warfare realm. That no longer is the case.
Well, is Armenia's usage of the democracy narrative part of this? To engage, or
it's one component, but it's not full part of it, because Armenia was deemed a democracy by the West after 2018, right? And so in that context, if democracy was the defining variable, it should have worked all the way up to 2022 and beyond. So democracy has been helpful in Armenia being able to sort of, change some of the perceptivity from the West, but it was never enough. The defining factor was the Western pivot, because that gave you the instrument to basically counteract the misinformation warfare that Azerbaijan was declaring.
How did the Western pivot give us that?
Because whereas in the past, you would basically work very hard to convince the West that you're not a Russian satellite, and they won't believe you, because they said, well, you're a member of the CSTO. 90% of your arms come from Russia. Russia defines your security architecture. Of course, you're a Russian satellite. So by virtue of pivoting, by decoupling, which the pivot produced, right? Now, when you go to Western capitals, the Azerbaijani discourse no longer works. So when Azerbaijan tries to make the argument that Armenia is a Russian satellite, nobody believes that, because there's no basis for